And welcome into PressBox Live. I'm Stan the Fan Charles from PressBox and PressBoxOnline.com. And with me is Mr. Gary Stein. Gary, how are you?
I'm great, Stanley. Thank you. How are you?
All right. For the first time, I'm moving into the iPad era, and I'm not seeing what I'm used to seeing. So anyway,
well, you look a hell of a lot better.
I know I'm looking better. Our guest tonight is the chairman of the Maryland Stadium Authority, and that is Thomas Kelso. Tom, how are you tonight?
Hey, Stan, I'm fine. I'm great. It's great to be here tonight. Good to see you, Gary.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, we wanted to start off. We got a whole lot of ground to cover with you, but I did want to start off. It's pretty amazing when I started to do the research to get you on tonight, that the Maryland Stadium Authority, which sort of was born out of the Camden Yards, building Camden Yards, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary. The Maryland Stadium Authority now has been around 35 years. Now, I know you've only been with them this is into year 36. I know you've only been with them since 2015, but could you talk a little bit about the history of the organization?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Well, the Maryland Stadium Authority was actually conceived by then Mayor and then ultimately Governor Schaefer as a concept to be able to own and ultimately develop and build a baseball stadium. And it was really the creation of the Maryland Stadium Authority and the work that was done by the very first chairman, Herb Belgrad, that was really instrumental in not only being able to help convince the legislature to fund the construction of Oriole Park, but also the negotiation of the first lease between the Maryland Stadium Authority and the Baltimore Orioles that were at the time owned by Edward Bennett Williams. So he did a fantastic job, and I really have had great honor of being able to get to know him and listen to his advice and all the perspective that he gives from a time period that wasn't a lot dissimilar to where we are today.
Have you sat down with a lot of the people that have been in your position? I mean, do you know Bruce Huffman? Have you talked to John Moog about things? I mean, it's been a pretty storied history there.
Yeah, well, there's only been, I'm the 8th MSA chairman, and so it's a pretty small group of people. And they've all been very generous with their time, with their thoughts, with their ideas. We support one another, and I've gotten to know, each of them, and each of them has different perspectives and backgrounds. And then Bruce Huffman was actually the first executive director of the MSA.
Right.
And so the executive director today, Mike Friends, is actually the third executive director of the MSA. But Mike, I know, stays in contact with Bruce, and it's really important for the continuation of this, the history continuing into the future. And we can certainly learn a lot of lessons from what was done in the past, and figure out, do we want to continue some, or do we make some changes?
Before I turn you over to Gary Stein, we usually have a back and forth after two questions. I did want to ask you about one thing, the history, because I think that Edward Bennett Williams is still underappreciated in Baltimore. Edward Bennett Williams was terminally ill. He pretty much knew that he didn't have long to go when he signed that lease. Is that a pretty rare thing for somebody in that position to have done, to look out for the larger good of a community that wasn't really his community, rather than sort of leave it vague for his estate to map out?
Well, that's a great question. And I know John Angelos well. I knew his father well. I've known his father
Sure.
well. And I certainly know Steve Bisciotti and work a lot with Dick Cass. And I think that we are very blessed to have ownership groups in Baltimore that have carried on exactly the tradition that you're talking about, which is that while, yes, it's an investment of theirs, they really look at it as a public trust.
Yeah.
And, they represent Baltimore. They try to represent Baltimore exceptionally well as they possibly can. They invest in the community. Our owners have been very charitable and giving back to, various organizations in the city. You can see a lot of the things that the Ravens do. It's a little bit more public. The things that the Angelos family has done, a little bit more private. But nonetheless, both have made significant investments in, Baltimore City and the surrounding area. And so, it's really, I think, a great question, Stan. It's very much a continuation. And we've been really blessed to have ownership groups that, really do care about Baltimore and, not just, people that are looking to, build up
Feather their own cap,
and then
so to
flip it
speak.
to somebody else.
Yeah. Gary, I want to turn Tom over to you for a couple.
All right, sounds good. Tom, first of all, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate the time. Before we get into some specifics about what the Stadium Authority is doing now, undertaking with the stadiums, baseball, football, et cetera, and Stan may get the first question on that, I wanted to have a little bit more background. I've always been curious and interested in the Maryland Stadium Authority, the business side of sports, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, in general, does every state have a stadium authority? Like, how does it work in the stadium authority world?
Well, there's probably no copycats because of the political situation in every jurisdiction is probably somewhat different. And sometimes, a city may control the authority. Sometimes it may be the state. Sometimes it may be the state and the city. But when there's publicly financed stadiums, very often they are done through an authority. And so there are, organizations that are similar to the Maryland Stadium Authority across the country. I'm not sure if we were the first, but if we're not the first, we're very early on in that idea of the ownership of stadiums. In Maryland, it's the Maryland Stadium Authority because primarily the funding for these stadiums comes from the taxpayers or the citizens of the state of Maryland. But Baltimore City is actually represented on our board. So the governor appoints 6 members of the board and the mayor appoints 1. There's a bill in the Maryland legislature now to expand the Stadium Authority Board from 7 seats to 9 seats that would allow the president of the Senate to appoint 1 and the Speaker of the House to appoint 1. So, it's not really a political board. We try to leave politics outside the board meetings. Our job is to oversee the work of the Maryland Stadium Authority, its mission, and to do everything we can to make sure that the taxpayers are getting the greatest benefit from all of the work that goes through the Stadium Authority. And it's not just stadiums. We're doing all the schools construction for Baltimore City. We're now going to be doing all the bond issuances for statewide school construction. And depending on what the local education authority wants us to do, is that we may actually build schools in different jurisdictions across the state. We're opening up the 4th phase of the Ocean City Convention Center this weekend, which is a Stadium Authority project. We're building the minor league stadium and sports complex and our entertainment complex in Hagerstown. And we did the Fair Hill International, or the Fair Hill 5-star upgrades to the Fair Hill Special Event Zone. And Terry Hasseltine's group ran the event. So, we do a lot of things all across the state, and the stadiums just happen to be one.
Can you give us an idea along those same lines, Tom? Can you give us an idea of how much revenue sports in general bring into the state of Maryland? I'm not just talking about the 2 stadiums. I'm talking really about everything that you just mentioned. Fair Hill, amateur sports, all the events, et cetera, et cetera.
Preakness, yeah, the Preakness.
Yeah, everything.
Yeah, I can get you those figures. I don't have them off the top of my head. I can tell you is that over the last 30 years, we've been able to identify about $1 billion of tax revenue that is directly related to the Camden Yards Sports Complex being there. And that doesn't include, all of the ancillary development that has taken place around the stadiums, Stadium Square, the south end of the stadiums down toward the Horseshoe Casino, et cetera, as well as all of the investments that's gone on in the counties and all of the ancillary benefit of having the sports teams being on television, being identified with Baltimore, all the great images of the city that we all see every time we're on Monday Night Football or Sunday Night Football or, a national baseball game, et cetera. So, all of it is really important to the economy. We only spent $670 million of principal and interest in order to build the Camden Yards complex. So, you can see is that, just the complex alone has produced about 50% more revenue than the out-of-pocket cost to do it, which is money that goes back in the general fund and is used for a number of purposes, such as schools, construction, et cetera. So, I think that sports is a way, Gary, to have the best of both, where we need some public investment, but it produces way more than that investment back into communities, whether it be the city, whether it be the counties, individual towns, such as minor league stadiums, et cetera, as well as the state. And, we're a major league city because we have major league teams. If we were to lose one or both of these teams for whatever reason in the future, it would really hurt not just Baltimore City, but the entire region. Same thing with the Preakness. Same thing with the BMW Golf Classic at Caves Valley. These are fantastic things that raise the profile of the area at the same time producing economic returns.
I want to talk, Tom, a little bit about what's going on with the lease discussions with both teams, because I know concurrently you've got two big clients there, and both have their own individual needs. And I want to talk a little bit about that. But before I do, you and I, before we went on the air, were talking a little bit about Terry Hazeltine and his group at Maryland Sports. Terry likes to fly under the radar a little bit, but I thought because you work shoulder to shoulder with him, if you could talk a little bit, because when Gary alluded to how many things we have going on in this state, the 5-star, the cycling classic, these are things that didn't exist before Terry's office. How valuable Terry is as an asset to the state and the economic development.
We actually like to say that Terry is maybe one of the, if not the biggest, certainly one of the biggest economic development assets in Maryland. But nobody knows who he is. But the people in the sports world, especially in the youth, amateur, and the collegiate level, people really know who Terry Hazeltine is. He's an exceptionally knowledgeable person in all forms of sport, including equine, which is huge in the state of Maryland.
Yep.
And he has just done a phenomenal job. And I know that you had him on just recently to talk about the World Cup, and he has brought Maryland and Baltimore really to the cusp of being potentially one of the cities that will either get games or be the host city for one of the teams. And that was a very uphill battle from the very beginning. And we could not have done it without Terry and the group he's pulled together. He's really a phenomenal asset.
All right, I do want to move into talking about the lease discussions with both teams, because the lease discussions and you've already talked about John Angelos on the Orioles side, Steve Bisciotti. Neither of them is pulling a heavy leverage play, but I'm sure that they want certain things that they want. There's a piece of legislation now, it's HB 896, and that's going to go before the voters next year. Could you talk a little bit about what that piece of legislation allows you to do in your discussions with both teams?
Sure. Well, just to clarify, HB 896 will come up for a vote in the Maryland House of Delegates, hopefully, and then we'll pass over to the Maryland Senate, and hopefully pass the Senate, and then hopefully be signed by the governor.
All right, I did put the cart before the horse. I'm sorry.
But to put it all into context is that one of the things that I have a lot in common with Herb Belgrad and John Moe is that we happen to be chairman at a time when either new leases needed to be negotiated, a team needed to be relocated, and a stadium built and a lease negotiated, which John Moe did a phenomenal job of. And now we come to the time frame where the Orioles lease is basically up. The Ravens lease has about 5 years to run. And so what we've done is that we've worked in tandem with both teams. And rather than talking about terms of a lease, the most important thing for us to understand is that we need to understand what's important to them. And that if you look at the relationship between the MSA and the teams, it's really a partnership. It's probably the most successful public-private partnership in Maryland history, because it's produced solid economic returns, and at the same time, it's kept these two teams in Maryland. And so the idea is that if we're partners, is that obviously we want them to stay and they want to stay, but we have to find a way to help them make more money, because if they make more money, we're going to make more money. That's just the way sports works. So we're not combatants. They're not taking something from us. We're working with them to figure out how can we work together to where they can be more successful and ultimately we can be more successful. So that's what's behind this bill, is that what we understand is that the most important thing to the teams is to be able to reinvest in those stadiums frequently, and that sports is changing so much is that the way we watch sports 10 or 15 or 20 years ago is not the way people today want to watch sports. And the only way that the teams really are ultimately successful is by bringing people to the stadiums, because the TV money is the TV money. And in football, everybody gets the same TV money.
Yep.
The differentiator is the fan experience and bringing people to the stadiums. And so what we've done is that we've put this bill together that will allow the Stadium Authority to issue up to $1.2 billion worth of bonds for $600 million, up to $600 million for the Orioles and $600 million for the Ravens, so that they can work independently and at their own pace in order to reinvest in the stadiums in ways that make the stadiums adaptable and creative in ways to bring more fans to the stadiums. We also want and encourage working with the teams to try to make the complex more of a live, work, play environment, to where not only 81 days plus some playoff games for the Orioles and 9 home games plus some playoff games for the Ravens, and maybe each team does a couple concerts. What we want is that we want there to be activity in the complex more days, right? We want to find more ways to utilize these great assets. So you don't have to be a sports fan to want to come to the stadiums. So maybe it's sports gaming, maybe it's a concert venue, maybe it's restaurants, maybe it's, I don't know. We've got offices already in the warehouse. I think we can better utilize the space in the warehouse. Maybe it's a boutique hotel, but we want people coming and being on that complex much more often. And we want to drive traffic to the south end, to the Horseshoe, to Top Golf, to the Paramount. But we also believe is that if we make these investments correctly, is that there'll be private investment that comes in around the stadiums so that, Don Schaefer's original vision of this revitalizing the west side of downtown Baltimore, which we've gotten a fair amount of. But we didn't, I think he would admit that we haven't gotten all the way there yet.
Yep.
And so I think there's greater economic return that can be achieved, but we're going to need to have the state capital, the public capital in initially, and then we can leverage that with private capital. So, we're not precluding the teams from investing in the stadiums, and we're not precluding third parties from coming and investing in the surrounding area. This is just a way for us to help stimulate it and to make sure that our stadiums are in top condition and that the fan experience is really being created, periodically, so that, we may do one project this year and 3 years later we'll do another one, and 3 years later another one. And so that there's always something for the fans to come back and see and experience and do something different. That's what we've learned from the teams. And so that's the genesis of this, is to make sure that we have this relationship and the funding to work all the time with the teams and not put ourselves in this position down the road where 10 years or 15 years or 30 years from now, we got to redo this whole thing. Let's just keep it going and not put ourselves in this position. And, we pray that the Bishottis and the Angeloses own these teams, but if they don't, whoever owns them, we want to be their partner, and we're going to be a good partner for them.
Before I turn you over to Gary, I just have to say it was a great answer. But while you were talking about the partnership and about how it's not adversarial, I was saying, boy, I wish he was negotiating between the MLBPA and Major League Baseball, because they are really lost right now. Gary, go ahead.
It really is shocking to me that people can't figure out a way to come to a solution where both parties win. And if you look at it from how do both parties win, there's a deal to be cut. And, that's the approach that we've taken in our relationship with the Orioles and the Ravens, and they've reciprocated. So we just have great relationships with them.
That's wonderful.
So actually, it's interesting that Stan mentions that, Tom. I was going to, I think it's the right time here then. You talk about the impasse between the Major League owners and the Major League Baseball Players Association. What, if any, impact does that have on the current negotiations with the Orioles right now? Like, what's happening with them in light of this situation?
Well, none of this stuff helps, right? On the heels of COVID, any delay in the start of the season, cancellation of games, et cetera, it's damaging to the Orioles and it's damaging to the Maryland Stadium Authority by extension, because if they do well, we do well. And if they're not doing well, we're not going to do well. And so, the people at the Maryland Stadium Authority, including me, we're huge fans. We're sports fans, and but we're also business people. And it's not a great situation if we have to cancel games. But I don't attribute that to the Orioles. That's a Major League Baseball issue, and the Orioles are going to suffer just right along with us. It's not slowing down our discussions with the Orioles. To be honest with you, is that we really need to get this bill passed, and if we get this bill passed, is that I think that the remainder of the negotiations with the Orioles will fall in place, and I have a great relationship with John and vice versa, and I think that we agree on way more than we disagree, and we'll find a way to overcome the points on which we disagree.
Tom, I wanted to ask you, one of the first books that my dad ever got me, actually, I was like 5 or 6 years old, that I remember. It was really a coffee table book, but it was fascinating to me. And the book was about baseball stadiums. It had pictures, black and white pictures of old baseball stadiums, big pictures, big book, coffee table book. And, the old stadiums, Ebbets Field and the old Yankee Stadium and Fenway and Crosley Field and all of them, the old Comiskey Park, Shibe Park,
Forbes Field,
Field, all of them. And, the black and white pictures and the graininess of it, it always stuck with me. And so my question is, most of those stadiums are not around anymore, right? The only really two iconic stadiums that are still around really from those days, basically Wrigley and Fenway. Yankee Stadium is gone. I guess Dodger Stadium, maybe you could call that, but not really. When you look into the future, is it possible that a stadium, and this is for baseball stadiums really more than football stadiums, but is it possible that Camden Yards could one day reach 100 years old? Like, what goes into that,
Gary, I am so happy you asked me that question.
That's a great question.
Because,
Yep.
Today, Oriole Park for a number of years was the #1 baseball stadium in the country. Everybody wanted to see Oriole Park. And it still is in the top 5 on just about every survey that you find. But, we have not been able to make significant capital reinvestment in the stadium. And so there are some, structural things that we need to do as part of this overall reinvestment. But our goal is to extend the lives of both stadiums. We want these stadiums through this program, which allows for constant reinvestment. And every time there's reinvestment, the leases are extended in order to justify the issuance of new bonds. So that we've got this partnering relationship that by the way it'll work, actually will keep extending the lives of these stadiums as far into the future as we can. And as you know, is that new stadiums are incredibly expensive to build. So while $1.2 billion sounds like a lot, and it is that, we watched the Super Bowl in a $5 billion stadium.
Right.
We watched the Ravens lose to the Raiders in Las Vegas in a $2 billion stadium. And last summer, we watched the Orioles play the Texas Rangers in a new $1 billion baseball stadium that replaced a stadium that was built after Oriole Park.
Correct.
So,
24 years.
We got to remember is that Oriole Park is 30 years old. It's really a couple of years older than that, age-wise. It just sat there before it got played in. But it is an iconic venue. And if we keep reinvesting in it, the goal would be to let's see how far in the future we can do this. And that hopefully we don't ever have to rebuild a baseball stadium. And maybe we don't have to rebuild a football stadium, but at least for the next 25 to 30 years plus, the plan that we put in place should extend the lives of these stadiums and allow them to be viable and leading stadiums in their separate sports. So that's the goal.
Good.
Great question by Gary. I want to follow up with it. It's kind of interesting to me, Tom, that and I just lost my train of thought because I wanted to ask you that question, but we're talking with Thomas Kelso, who's the chairman of the Maryland Stadium Authority. And Tom, I wanted to talk about this companion piece of legislation, and then I'll get back to my other question. HB 897 that goes along with HB 896. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. And Stan, this ties into as to how important sports is all across the state and an economic generator. The Orioles are probably one of the only, if not the only, major league team that actually has 3 of its 4 affiliates playing in its home state. And they play in stadiums that were built sometime in the last 15, 20 years or so. And those stadiums are starting to age. And, Major League Baseball has put some pretty strict requirements on minor league owners to upgrade their stadiums. Everything from surfaces to training facilities. And plus the stadiums are just starting to age. And so what HB 897 does is that it makes money available through the Maryland Stadium Authority, not just for minor league stadiums. There are actually, one in Salisbury, there's one in Aberdeen, there's one in Frederick. It needs to be upgraded so that Frederick can get another major league affiliate. And in Bowie, we're building one in Hagerstown. There's one in Southern Maryland. Those are all really important, but we also have other sport and entertainment venues in Maryland that are also important. Fair Hill needs additional investment. The Prince George's County Equine Center that they're doing where There's a 5-star show jumping event that's going to be held there that Terry helped recruit to Maryland.
Yep.
All of these types of things need to have capital and upgrading in order for Maryland to really be able to compete, in order to be able to have, the robust sports breadth of sports that we have. There's also the possibility that that bill might be amended to include maybe some youth sports complexes. And I think that, it's possible that that may happen, because youth and amateur sports is, hugely profitable and a big tourist draw to Maryland.
The question that popped out of my head real quick was, you've been in your position since 2015. Are some of these visions, Tom, are they your visions? Are they Larry Hogan's visions because he appointed you, or they come about together?
You're trying to get me fired?
No, not at all. Just the opposite. Just the
No.
opposite. I'm very impressed with the overall vision, and part of it has to do with the timing of when you're in the position of being the chairman of the Maryland Stadium Authority. These kind of things have to be thought about, but I'm very impressed with the overall vision that you espoused during answering Gary's question about the lifespan of these stadiums.
Well, to be honest, is that, the concepts that we're talking about were developed by the authority during our work with the teams, right? We had to learn, we had to really find out, because we're not building new stadiums, what's important as we go forward. And so once we did that, the senior leadership of the authority, we put this concept together, and we went to the governor. We sat down with the governor and we got his input, and he has a lot of background experience in commercial development, et cetera. And he had some great perspective that, we took back, and we made some modifications that, I think were really additive to the bill. He also has a strong relationship with the Ravens ownership and with the Orioles ownership. And, he had some perspective that he added to our thought process. So, I like to say is that this is the governor's bill, it's the governor's vision, but, the people that the governor can't do everything by himself.
Yep.
And, the team at the Maryland Stadium Authority has certainly been really instrumental in, pulling all of this together and helping to bring it to the House. We've also had conversations with the leadership in the House and the Senate, and they've had input, and we've worked collegially with them, and we find them to be very knowledgeable about this as well, and concerned about the future of sports in Maryland and the Camden Yards complex. So it's really been it's not been a combative relationship at all.
Yeah.
It's, really a lot of smart people, all with really different perspectives, but really smart people, all with really good background and intention. And I think we've been able to, put something together that hopefully we can get the majority of people to agree with.
It really helps to all have your oars going in the same direction. It really does. Gary, before we let Tom,
get this done,
before we let Tom go, you have one last question for him?
I did. I was curious, Tom, the nature of the two stadiums and the teams that occupy them. It's a two-part question. Is it fair to say that because the Orioles use that stadium 80 times a year and the Ravens use their stadium 10 times a year, that the wear and tear on Camden Yards is more than the wear and tear on M&T Bank Stadium? That's part one. And again, because one uses it 80 and one uses it 10, are the needs and the wants of the teams different because of that?
Gary, I couldn't have written the questions any better than you're asking them. It's really phenomenal. And I appreciate you asking that. They're two different sports, right? And, I think people tend to lump them together because they're both professional sports teams. but they operate in completely different environments. And as you point out, they have different lengths of schedules, number of home games, et cetera. But they also, the leagues operate completely different and there's a lot of things about football we wish baseball did. There's probably some things in baseball that we wish football did. So what we have to do is that we have to be docile enough to be able to adapt our thinking to work with the Ravens that may be different than what we do with the Orioles, because the needs are different. And the things that are really critical to bringing people into the football stadium when they could sit home and have an unbelievable television experience, okay, are different than maybe the things that go into trying to convince people to come to multiple Oriole games, maybe a 10-seat package, a 10-game package, a 13-game package, whatever, is trying to get the fans coming more frequently. So the needs are different. The wear and tear is different, although they age the same way. Steel ages the same way. And so when I talk about infrastructure things, it's just a normal wearing and aging that you have to be careful between concrete and steel. And if, I'm not knocking other people's stadiums, but there's other stadiums that aren't too far away where, railings fall off. And we don't have that happening at our stadiums, even though our stadiums are older. And but the sports are different, the needs of the teams are different, and yet we have to be flexible enough and smart enough and creative enough to be able to work with both of them and work with both of them simultaneously, because they both want to move forward and they both want to be reinvesting back in the stadiums and trying to increase the fan experience at the same time. And that's why this bill is structured the way it is so we can work with both teams at the same time on their pace. And that doesn't mean we don't have input. We'll have input, but they really have to drive it, because they're the people that are selling the tickets. They're the people that interface with the fans. So, we're definitely led by the ownership and management of both teams and helping guide what we do.
Tom, I want to thank you very much. We've been talking with Thomas Kelso, who's the chairman of the Maryland Stadium Authority. And assuming that HB 896 and HB 897 do pass, and we need to get them passed by the voters, we'd like to have you on sometime as we get closer to next year's vote. All right?
It won't go to the voters. When it's approved by the legislature and signed by the governor,
I'm glad you clarified.
It'll be done. But as we get closer to this being voted on, I'd be happy to come back. It would be sometime in April, I would assume, or maybe after we get them passed, we can come back and talk some more. I've enjoyed it, and I really do appreciate you having me on and listening to this. It's important, I think, to the city, to the state, to the fans of both teams, and I really hope that people will support us, be outspoken in support of what we're trying to achieve. And I really appreciate you guys doing everything that you do.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, really appreciate it. Very impressive interview. Thank you very much for coming on.
Have a great night, all right?
All right, you too. For Gary Stein and I'll be back with Ross Grimsley on Monday night talking a little baseball, and Gary and I will be working on next week's guests. Thanks again to Thomas Kelso, chairman of the Maryland Stadium Authority.
Have a good night.
You too.